our First Nation leadership and our First Nation people and our children and their families aren't interested in the further erosion of our rights and who we are as a people. We know we have a distinct language. We know that we have our culture. We know we are a society. We are a people with our own governments. And that's what needs to be understood. And this is where I believe that, that this government again failed to sit down with First Nation governments to address the poverty that's there. And the AFN, the Assembly of First Nations, will continue to make poverty history awareness campaigns throughout this country and throughout internationally if we have to. And again, if that's what Canada requires to move, then that's what the Assembly of First Nations and the First Nations people of this country will have to do.
The budget is doing nothing for our First Nations, I can assure you of this. It's very disappointing and frustrating. First of all, it disregards the basic human rights for the basic needs that ordinary Canadians enjoy. We will not have that. In that budget, they talked about mortgaging homes on First Nations. First of all, First Nations don't own that property. It is in the hands of the federal government. So how is that going to work? With the poverty on our First Nations at sometimes 98% is on social, how are you going to have mortgages that our people can acquire? It's just not going to happen. That's not going to address the needs. I know that the chiefs and councils have been under a lot of pressure. They work very hard. We spend a lot of time dealing with all these issues, and it just seems like it's falling on deaf ears. The government isn't listening. Well, when our national chief talks about negotiation, confrontation, sometimes confrontation may be the avenue to go, because sometimes nobody is listening. And I feel like sometimes that the province isn't listening. Sometimes the province doesn't hear us. And I know the federal government is offloading programs and services to the province, and there's always the jurisdiction battle. We hear it time after time, you know, that they're not our responsibility. So who is the responsibility? As a chief of our reserve, we are responsible for our people and the well-being of our people. And unfortunately, it's not happening. It's disgraceful, and I think the government should be embarrassed for what they're trying to do to our people. And I think that the United Nations should hear exactly what's happening here.
I am very disappointed in the release of the budget. It doesn't do anything for First Nations. I think the government officials, with all the money that they're spending, should take the time to come into our First Nations and go door to door and look at the houses in the dilapidated conditions that they are, and to see that some of the places have no running water. Just for them to come into the communities and see for themselves exactly how we are living in our communities, while the government sits in their big thrones and do nothing, just spend money. We need nurses and doctors to deal with the communicable diseases, the diabetes, the chronic conditions in the community. It's poverty all the way down the line. The mold issues in the housing. We can't afford houses. Sure, our community has taken on 25 homes through CMHC, then hoping to go through that home ownership program, which we don't have money for. The band is going to get caught up in that. When the people cannot pay for those houses, then the band is the one that has to pay for them. That's not the solution, but because we don't have housing, we have to go that route. And I think the government should be ashamed that they make us live in those conditions.
The observation that I have to make is that Canada's Aboriginal people will continue to live in shameful conditions, which has been recognized by the House of Commons, by the Prime Minister. The irony of the situation is that, well, today in the House of Commons, Bill C-292 will get third reading, and it's about the implementation of the Kelowna Accord, the investment of $5 billion to better the conditions of First Nations people. And then in the budget was just announced this week, there are no provisions to make improvements in First Nations communities. And it's a form of fiscal discrimination, it's a human rights violation, and it needs to be addressed.
The political accord was signed in April '04. The government, today's government doesn't recognize it, but they weren't there neither when the treaties were signed, and they must be honored. Thank you.
If I could get someone to define to me in what way you may confront the government.
Just quickly, in British Columbia alone, we have over 100 title and rights cases before the courts. That's one form of conflict or confrontation that's costing everybody. It's costing communities that are already impoverished but are doing everything in their power to protect their title and rights. And it's costing the economy. It's costing all Canadians. The conflict that we have, that's only one region. You extrapolate out, for the entire country, and we have an environment of conflict, right? Not of mutual respect and recognition, which is what the courts have instructed this country to do, is to sit down with First Nations. And where that frustration runs deep, you end up having it spill out onto the streets, where the youth, because they feel so disconnected and disenfranchised and let down by what successive governments have done over the course of history, will take things into their own hand. And today we invite the Aboriginal youth to join us in helping to understand what's going on in this country and the treatment that we're receiving from the federal governments. We invite that because we're going to need them to be working with us, walking with us. We're going to need their guidance, instruction, and wisdom and energy, because they are the vast majority of Aboriginal people in this country right now, quite contrary to that of the mainstream Canadian population. So I just wanted to make that point, that we have extreme conflict and confrontation happening as we speak because of these sorts of attitudes.
And may I ask whether perhaps, I know some chiefs are diplomatic, some are more outspoken, but with this new budget, will things change as far as, being more outspoken against the government?
Well, I think you're hearing that already, and you may have heard that in the National Chief's comments. The statement in the news said that a genteel leader speaks out in disappointment. And if what the government is doing is frustrating our National Chief, you can imagine the frustration that runs on to the rest of our chiefs, because he has been very diplomatic. He has done everything possible in his power, with the support of the leadership of Canada, to work with this government, and the government has chosen not to. When you agree to certain things and you enter into memorandums of understanding and you shake somebody's hand, there's honor attached to that. On our side, there's honor attached to that. And we work with them. We continue to do the things they ask of us. And what happens on the other hand? They throw it on the floor under their feet. Handshake means nothing, and a MOU does not mean anything, just like the treaties that are not being acknowledged, and Aboriginal title and Aboriginal rights not being acknowledged at all.
You said there's already the $9 billion coming out of Indian Affairs, and that's enough. And it seems that the government is turning this around and saying these social problems aren't because of lack of money, it's because of bad management.
I disagree when the Minister of Indian Affairs gets up each time in the House when he's being questioned and asked, why is there such poverty in First Nation community, when he keeps saying the same thing. $9 billion is being spent. No, $9 billion is not reaching the First Nation communities. And if you were to get the $9 billion to reach the First Nation communities, you wouldn't see the kind of poverty that exists in our First Nation communities. That's the simple answer, and that's the quick answer, is that there is no $9 billion that gets to the First Nation communities.
I think the minister had all the answers when he was in opposition, but now he's in a situation to actually do something. It's, I don't know if it's him or if it's the Prime Minister or it's the climate of, I guess, the party that he's with, but obviously, we've told him right up front, First Nations see the Tory government as being scary, and we gave them an opportunity to work with us and to try to turn that myth around, and obviously they haven't taken that opportunity. Areas like my colleague Sean talked about, this whole idea of land claim negotiations or self-government or treaty talks. Their policy's outdated. Jim Prentice knows that. He was a commissioner on the Indian Claims Commission. Been no movement on that. That would have been a real easy area for him to start with. Just like Chief Clark said, applying market-based housing to communities that have no money don't make no sense when the land is held in trust by the federal government. So ask them to explain that to you, how that's going to work, because we surely don't know how it's going to work. We've advocated very clearly that the road to self-sufficiency is creating money and economic development. we don't see any money in that there budget for economic development. If anything, they're just trying to hold us at bay, and it's for those that are in treaty negotiations or land claim negotiations across the country, very clearly the government has set a marker. It's negotiating within the money that's already there. So, at the end of the day, we're going no farther than negotiating our own poverty. So, it's one step ahead and two steps back, unfortunately.
You're talking about confrontation, you're talking about this groundswell of youth coming up. Are we going to see more barricades? Are we going to see more of that kind of lashing out?
I'm not advocating for such, but at the same time, the government is not wanting to negotiate. So the youth, I think, are hearing and seeing that there is no movement on the part of government to wanting to address our issues. And yes, they may take matters into their own hands. Case in point in Caledonia, there's an outstanding claim that hasn't been addressed and hasn't been dealt with, and yet this government of the day still refuses to acknowledge the outstanding issues there and to want to deal with the people of Six Nations of the Grand River in that particular case. So the people, the youth, are going to take matters into their own hands if they are not seeing the success that National Chief has been talking about of negotiating and having reasonable dialogue and fairness in terms of policies at the end of the day that we have to live with.
It should be noted that June 29th, by resolution at the Assembly of First Nations National Assembly, is being called on to be a National Day of Action. And in response to the question, I think that refers to some of the deep frustration that First Nations are feeling. And if we do not, and I mean First Nation governments, First Nations leaders, and federal government representatives, political leaders, if we do not fill that void and start talking, then there will naturally be consequences to that. And it feels like the gauntlet's been dropped by the Prime Minister when it comes to picking a fight, if you will, with First Nations. And so it's going to be up to the communities, the grassroots people, the chiefs across the country, and they've instructed the Assembly of First Nations to begin looking at a National Day of Action on the 29th.
Chief Whitecloud, if you could address just the size of that population that's coming up in those First Nations communities.
Well, if you go to the CanWest Foundation report, which they did a study, a think tank last year in June, I believe it was, about the population growth, and the fact that the provinces in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, specifically in Alberta and the Western region, need to address, for economy's sake, that if you don't address our populations, you are putting your economic future in danger. Our growth annually, the government has allocated us since 1997, capped it at 3%. Our growth in health, I know, is 9.3. And as a former regional director of education, I do know that after we do compliance, our growth has been at about 7-point-something%. So there's a 4% gap and more in growth, just for education services. Our population growth, the Government of Canada says it's growing at 11.2%, I think. Well, we know that those numbers are 4 years and lagging. So what is it in 4 years' time? It's much more than that. And those kind of things are not being factored in. I don't know who is advising. I mean, there are plenty of people paid in bureaucracy who know this information, to feed it in, so that something positive comes. And definitely, nothing positive has come out of the announcement yesterday.
I guess what I'm getting at also is that there's a large young population of disenfranchised youth is coming up, it sounds like, is what you're saying. Am I right?
Well, they're going to feel disenfranchised when nothing is getting done. It's not getting better.
This is an open question for anybody who wants to answer it. I was wondering what would be the 3 things you would need to see changed in order for the Aboriginal issues in this country to truly be addressed.
Yeah, there's one principal shift that has to occur, and that is there must be, and again, to reiterate, what the courts have affirmed over 30 times across this country, a fundamental respect and recognition of our Aboriginal title and treaty rights, which means that they must sit down with us and talk to us, and we've been shut out. market-based, Warren Buffett ideology type solutions that leave it up to the market to solve all your problems is just not going to work. As my colleague said, social justice must be a part of the equation. We can't leave it up to the market to fix these issues. That's what governments are in place for. And I think that's what we're calling on the government to do, and I think that's what we're inviting Canadians to work with us on. This is the government of the day. And we have to find ways, as we've been saying this whole time, supporting the National Chief, to reach out, to have a real conversation, real dialogue with governments. That's not what's happening. So I would boil it down to one principal priority, and that is that there needs to be respect and recognition of our title and treaty rights, and we must be included, and we've been shut out. If we're included, then we can help be designers of our own destiny. And we can help inspire youth for the possibilities of the future. We can help this country prosper even more than it is right now. But our people need to be included, and we're being left behind. And I think that's important for everybody to understand.
Canada is a very rich country. It's one of the richest countries in the world. And the claims that have been outstanding for more than a century have got to be settled, and Canada's got to really put some effort to settling the 861 claims that are backed up in the system, which will provide the First Nations with some additional source of revenue. And there has to be a fair sharing of the resources of this rich country with the people that originally inhabited this land for several centuries before the coming of the European nations. And right now it has never happened, and it needs to start happening now.
I think yesterday there was mention about Afghanistan women, and my concern is, why is the government of Canada so concerned about the women across the ocean when the women here are in need? It just doesn't make any sense.
I think this last little bit sums it up. It has to do with respect and reconciliation. As the courts have said, we're all here to stay. We must find some way forward. Our children, our grandchildren, and their descendants are going to be on these lands. And 100 years from now, the question that will be asked is, what did you do while you were here? When you had the chance to do something, what did you do? Did you fulfill your responsibility? So I think that's the challenge that's before us. Obviously, it's a tremendous challenge in the face of this budget. And as leaders, we have a responsibility to reflect the feelings of our people and our feelings about the way that we feel we're being treated by this current federal government. And we challenge not only the government, but the rest of the citizens who live across this country to help understand the deep and desperate needs that exist, and our willingness to engage in real dialogue about real change that will benefit everybody.
Thank you.
Indian Affairs operates on 80 different funding formulas to provide services to the community level. Many of those formulas haven't had an increase in more than a decade.
What do you see happening? Again, we hear words like frustration, despair, poverty. Will we see an increase in barricades and confrontations?
The younger First Nations people have run out of patience. They don't have the patience that the older generation do to tolerate and take inequity, and they're going to react and to call the attention of the public to a very serious problem that's been long overdue in being addressed.
What can you suggest that the Finance Minister do at this point? I mean, the budget's been handed down. What would you like to see happen now?
Well, the Finance Minister needs to ensure that there's accountability for the promises that the government has made. You know, the government's entered into, agreed to provide $5 billion under the Kelowna Accord. The Prime Minister, as I understand, agreed to have meetings about its implementation. It's the subject of Bill C-92 that's going to be debated at 5:30 today, which is it's a money bill, providing money to First Nations people. So, you would expect that the budget would be making some provisions to address the problems that the media have identified, that the chiefs have identified, that the AFN's identified, that have been the subject of various presentations at the Standing Committee of Aboriginal Affairs. And right now, it's very inadequate and a form of discrimination not to begin to address those very serious issues, because for a lot of First Nations people's conditions don't even meet the minimum standards of health or housing that is in Canada's National Building Code. And the government, the Prime Minister, the leader of the country, had to say that the conditions were shameful. And And so I guess what's the government's plan to alleviate the shameful conditions of our people? 99% of the land and resources have been taken from our people, and that's the basis of Canada's wealth.
There's a lot of talk about elections these days, especially on the budget. Do you think a change in government would bring about any of the changes necessary, or would the approach of all parties be more or less just talk, as it has been up till now?
There's a huge need to educate the people who sit in government, and what I would like to see happen is the National Chief address the whole House of Commons, and at the regional level, the Regional Chief to address the various provincial legislatures about the plight of First Nations people.
Do you see that happening anytime soon?
I guess that's a decision that the government will have to make. I think it's long overdue. Like when we lobby government, one thing that's very clear to us is that the people who are elected to government really don't know really very much about the plight of First Nations people.
And just one more question. Again, are there any changes you would like to see that are absolutely necessary for anything else to change in the Aboriginal communities?
The government has got to get serious about settling the 861 land claims that have been filed in the government. There has to be more resources to administrate those claims, and more resources provided to settle, which is the subject of the Senate Committee report of December 2006. And that we have to get a fair share of the wealth of this country. Canada is a wealthy country, and there has to be political will to address the problems there, and to develop a plan in conjunction with the First Nations people to make it better. Like the question was asked about housing. I mean, our community operates a revolving loan. Our people pay mortgages on their property from the community's revolving loan fund. But there's not enough money to accommodate the mortgage demand or the renovation demand that's there. The people pay their loans back at 6% interest. It's generating capacity. It's a stepping stone to sustainability. But there has to be the investment and the financial commitment to make it work better.